The Traveling Companion. Poor Johansen was miserable. His father was ill and there was no hope of his recovering. It was late in the evening. They were alone together. The lamp on the table was burning low. "You have been a good son," whispered the father. "I am sure that God will help you and protect you." The dying man looked kindly and earnestly at his son. Then he breathed very deeply and died. He looked as if he were asleep. Johansen wept, for now he was alone in the world. He had neither father or mother, nor brothers or sisters. He kneeled down and kissed his father's hand. Many a tear ran down his cheek before he finally fell asleep with his head resting against the hard board of the bedstead. He dreamed a strange dream, in which the sun and the moon cursed before him. He saw his father too, alive and well. He heard him laugh as he always did whenever something amused him. A lovely girl, with long beautiful hair and gold crown on her head, took his hand in hers, and his father said to him, "This is your bride, the most beautiful girl in the world." Then he woke. The dream was over. His father was dead. There lay his cold body. He was all alone. Poor Jones! Next week, his father was buried. Jones walked behind the coffin. He could no longer see his father, whom he loved so much. He heard the earth fall on the coffin lid. He peered down into the grave. He could see the corner of the burial chest, another showful of earth, and that, too, was out of sight. At that moment, Jones felt that his heart would break from sorrow. A psalm was sung, and it sounded so beautiful that he burst out crying, and the tears relieved his grief. The sunlight played on the leaves of the trees. It was as if the sun wanted to stay. "Do not be sad, Jones. Can't you see how beautiful the blue sky is? Your father is up there, and he is begging God to help, so that all may go well with you." "I will try always to be good," thought Johansen. "Then I too will go to the heavens when I die and see my father again. I will have so much to tell him, and he will teach me about all the beautiful things in heaven, as he taught me about all of that is beautiful here on earth. Oh, how wonderful it will be!" For a moment, as the words became in pictures in Johan's mind, he smiled, though tears ran down his face. The little birds in the chestnut trees sang, "Tweet, tweet." They were happy even though they were attending a funeral. Or maybe they were happy because they knew that the dead man now had wings more beautiful than theirs, for he had been good while he lived on earth. Johansen saw how the little birds flew from the branches of the tree far out into the world, and he wanted to fly with them, but first he must carve a wooden cross to put on his father's grave. In the evening, when he was finished, he returned to the churchyard and found the grave covered with sand and decorated with flowers. The people of the village had wanted to show that they too loved his father and felt sorrow at his death. Early in the next morning, Johannes packed his few belongings into a small bundle and put his inheritance of 50 silver marks in a purse, which he hid under his belt. Now he was ready to go out into the world, but first he went to his father's grave to pray and say goodbye. "I shall always be good, father," he promised, "so that you may, without shame, bid God to protect me." As he walked across the fields, leaving the village behind him, the flowers nodded as the wind blew over them and said, "Welcome, Johannes, welcome to our green world. Is it not beautiful?" But Johannes could not hear them. He turned to look once more at the old church, where he had been baptized and where every Sunday he had attended service with his father and sung hymns. High up in one of the little windows of the tower he saw the church pixie with his red woolen hat. The pixie was shading eyes with his hand. The sun was shining right in his face. Johannes waved goodbye to him, and the pixie took off his hat and swung it over his head. Then he put his hand on his heart and blew kisses towards Johannes, to show that he wished him good luck and a happy journey. Johannes thought about all the beautiful things he would see in the big marvelous world as he walked on. farther and farther away from all that he knew. Soon he no longer recognized the countryside. He passed through villages and towns he had never seen before, and all the people he met were strangers. The first night he slept in a haystack and thought it was a fine bed anyone could have, that a king could not have offered him one more comfortable. The fields, the little rivers, the haystack, and the blue heavens above him, what a lovely bedchamber! The green grass dotted with red and white flowers was a carpet. The hedge of a wild rose and the elberry bushes were better than bouquets of flowers in vases, and the river, with its clear water, was his washing basin. The reeds that grew along its edge nodded to say both good morning and good night to him, and the moon was an excellent night lamp that couldn't set fire to the curtains. Here Drans could sleep peacefully, and he did, and only woke after the sun had risen and all the little birds started singing, "Good morning, good morning, aren't you up yet?" The bells rang from the church tower. It was Sunday. The people were going to church, and Joanne went too. He sang an hymn and listened to the minister preach. Everything was just as it was in the church, wherever he had been baptized and attended service with his father. In the churchyard, there was many graves where the grass grew high, for there was no one to tend them. Johannes thought of his own father's grave, which soon would look like this, now that he was not there to weed and plant flowers on it. He pulled up some of the grass and straightened the wooden crosses that had fallen. Then he took the wreaths that the wind had blown from the graves and put them back where he thought they belonged, hoping that some stranger would do the same for his father's grave. Outside the church stood a beggar. Johannes gave him a silver coin and then walked down, happy and content, out into the wide, wide world. Towards evening, a storm began to gather. Johannes looked for shelter, but the landscape was bare and uninhabited. Finally, when night had already fallen, he saw a little church on a hill. The door of the church was ajar. Here he would seek shelter until the storm was over. "I will just sit in a corner," he thought. "I am tired and need some rest." He sat down, folded his hands, and said his prayers. Then he fell asleep and dreamed, while the storm broke and lightning flashed and the thunder roared. When he woke, it was past midnight. The storm was over, and the moonlight shone through the windows into the church. Near the altar stood a coffin. It was open, and it lay a dead man who was to be buried the next day. Johannes was not afraid, for he had a good conscience, and he knew that dead cannot do anyone any harm. It is living, evil human beings one has to fear. Two such worthless men were now standing before the open coffin. They wanted to harm the dead man. They were preparing to take him out of his coffin and throw him out of the church. Poor dead man! "What are you doing?" cried Johannes. "It is sinful to disturb the dead. Let the poor man sleep in Jesus' name." "Nonsense!" screamed one of the wicked men. "He has cheated us. He owed us money which he couldn't pay back, and now he has died on top of it, and we shan't ever see a penny of our money again. But we shall have our revenge. We shall throw him in front of the church door, and there he can lie like a dog." "I have only 50 marks, said Johannes. "It is my inheritance from my father. I will give it to you if you will promise me to let the dead man lie in peace. I can't get along without money. I am strong, and God will help me." "Yes," sneered the wicked man. "If you will pay his debt, we shan't harm him." They took Johannes' money and laughed at his goodness, went on their way. Johannes put the dead man back into his coffin, folded the cold hands, and then as happy as ever entered the dark forest just beyond the church. The moonlight shone down through the leaves of the trees, and Johannes saw the little elves playing. For they did not mind his coming. They knew he was a good and innocent human being. Only from evil and disobedient people do the elves hide. Some of them were no bigger than Johannes' finger. Their long yellow hair was held in place by golden combs. 2 by 2 they would swing on the drops of dew that clung to the leaves and tops of the high grass. Sometimes the dewdrops would roll down among the grass, and how the elves would laugh. Oh, it was a joy to watch them. They sang all the songs that Johannes had learned when he was a child. Colorful spiders with silver crowns on their heads spun palaces and bridges through bush, which caught the dew and looked like grass in the moonlight. The elves played the whole night through. Only when the sun rose did they climb back into their flowers. Then the wind grabbed their bridges and palaces and carried them high into the air as flying spider webs. Johannes had just come out of the forest when he heard someone call behind him. "Wait, where are you going?" "Out into the wide world," answered Johannes. "I am a poor fellow who has neither father nor mother, but I am sure that God will help me." "I want to go out in the wild world too," said the stranger. "Let's be traveling companions." "That's a good idea," agreed Johannes, and so they went on together. It took no time for them to become fond of each other, for they were both good and kind. Johannes soon realized that the stranger was much wiser than he. He seemed to be able to talk about everything and to have been everywhere. There was hardly anything that excited that he did not know something about. The sun was high in the sky when they stopped to rest under a large tree. There they ate their lunch. Just as they were finishing, an old woman came hobbling along. Her back was bent and she had a crutch under one arm. Strapped to her back was a bundle of firewood which she had gathered in the forest, and her apron, which she had tied together to make a little sack. There were 3 bunches of birch switches. Suddenly she slipped and fell. She screamed, for she had broken her leg. The poor woman! Johannes suggested that they carry her to the home, but the stranger opened his knapsack and took out a little jar. In this there was a salve, which he said could cure her leg, make it whole and well again, so that she could walk home by herself, as if her leg had never been broken. As payment, he wanted the 3 bunches of birch switches she carried in her apron. "You want to be well paid," said the old woman, and nodded very strangely. She did not want to give up her switches, yet it was not pleased to lie there on the road with a broken leg. So she gave the switches to the stranger. As soon as he had rubbed a little salve on her leg, she was up and walking better than she had before. It was an unusual salve, not the kind that you can buy in the pharmacies. "What will you do with the switches?" asked Johannes. "Oh, I just took a fancy to them because I am a strange fellow, I suppose," said the wayfarer, and they walked on in silence. "Look at those heavy dark clouds," remarked Johannes, pointing in the horizon. "We are in for a storm." "No," laughed his companion. "They are no clouds. They are mountains, beautiful high mountains which one can climb right up into the sky, where the air is always fresh. They are marvelous. Believe me, tomorrow we shall rest that far out in the wild world." But the mountains were farther away than they thought. It was the next evening before they came to the foothills. Here started the great black forest that covered most of the mountain sides. There were boulders as large as whole villages. It would not be easy to cross these mountains, therefore, Johannes' traveling companion suggested that they stay at an inn for the night to be fresh for the morning climb. In the public room of the inn, a crowd had gathered. A traveling puppet theater was just about to give a performance. The spectators sat in rows facing the little stage. In the first row was a fat old butcher. He had taken the best seat, and next to him sat his dog, a ferocious-looking bulldog. The comedy began. It was a very nice play with a king and a queen in it. They sat on a throne and had golden crowns on their heads. The queen had a long dress that trailed behind her. It was expensive, but she could afford it. Wooden dolls with handlebar mustaches and glass eyes stood at the doors, opening and closing them in order to air the room. It was a lovely comedy with nothing tragic about it at all. But just as the queen was crossing the stage, the bulldog, God knows what the dog was thinking, his master, in any case, was not holding on to him, jumped right up onto the stage and grabbed the queen by her waist with great jaws. Crunch! Crack! It was a tragedy after all. The poor man who owned the puppet theater and had played all the parts was beside himself with misery. The queen was the most beautiful of all of his dolls, and now the bulldog had beheaded her. When all the rest of the audience had gone, Johannes' traveling companion said that he would repair the doll. He took out his little jar and put some salvage on it. It was the same salvage that helped the poor woman when she broke her leg. As soon as the salve had been smeared on the doll, she was whole again. But that was not all. The doll would move her little limbs by herself. The puppeteer was delighted. Now he didn't have to pull the strings anymore. The queen could dance by herself, and that was more than any of the dolls would do. When night came and everyone at the inn had gone to bed, deep and sorrowful sighs were heard. The lampering kept on, and finally they all got up to see what was the matter. The sighing came from the theater. The puppeteer opened the box that was also the small stage. All the wooden dolls were lying in a great heap. There were all the king and his followers, and it was they who were singing too mournfully. They stared with their glass-eyed out into the darkness. They wanted to be rubbed with the magic salve so they too would be able to move and dance like the queen. The queen kneeled down and held out her golden crown while she spoke. Please take this in return for putting some salve on my husband and his courtiers. The puppeteer whom owned the theater and all the dolls felt so sad that he cried and promised the wayfarer that he would give him all the money he received the following night, if only he would smear a little salve in 4 or 5 of the other dolls. Joanne's friend said he cared not for money. What he wanted was the old sword that the theater director had hanging from his belt. As soon as it was given to him, he rubbed a little salve on 6 of the dolls. They started instantly to dance so prettily that all the real people who had been standing around watching them began to dance too. The coachman danced with the cook and the waiters with the maids. The poker tried to dance with the little brass shovel that stood by the fireplace, but they didn't dance far. They fell with a clatter, and after they had taken their first steps, it was an exciting sight. The next day, Joannes and his friend left the inn and started to climb the mountains. Upwards they went through the dark forest of trees until the church steepless into the valley looked like little red berries amidst all the greenery below them. They could see the far and wide before them with views of dozens of places where they had not been. Joannes had never seen so much of the beautiful world all at once. The sun shone down from the cloudiness blue sky. From the valleys they heard from the sound of the hundreds of horns. The melody was so beautiful, the tears came into his eyes, and he could not help saying out loud, "Oh God, I could kiss you for your kindness to us all, for having given us such a beautiful world to live in." His companion had also folded his hands, was looking out over the forest and the towns. All at once they heard the strange but pleasant sound above them. They looked up. There was a great white swan, and the beautiful bird was singing as they had never heard a bird sing before. But its voice grew weaker and weaker, and finally it bent its head towards its body and fell to the ground. Right at their feet, there the lovely bird lay, dead. "What wonderful wings!" cried the wayfarer. "A pair of wings as white and large as those must be worth a lot. I shall have them. It is fortune I have a sword." With a single stroke he cut off both of the dead swan's wings, and now they were his. They traveled mile after mile, and yet they still were in the mountain. At last they came to a large town, more than 100 towers, stone as if they were made of silver. While the sunlight played upon them, in the middle of the town there was a great marble castle with a roof of gold, and that was where the king lived. Joannes and his friends stopped at the inn outside of the walls because they wanted to wash and change their clothes before entering the city. The innkeeper told them that the king was a very kind and friendly man who never did anyone any harm. But what a daughter he had! Oh, God preserve us! She was a horrible princess! Oh, she was beautiful enough. There was no one lovelier to look at. But what was good was that when she was as cruel and wicked as any witch, and had already caused the death of many fine princes. She had proclaimed that anyone could propose to her, prince or beggar alike. She didn't care who his suitor was. All he had to do, win her hand and become king when her father died, was to answer correctly 3 questions that she asked him. But if he failed, then he must have his head chopped off or hanged. That's how heartless and beautiful Princess was. Her poor old father was very sad indeed, but he could do nothing about it, for once, long ago, he had promised her never to interfere in the matters she chose as a husband. Every prince who had come to woo her, the princess had failed to guess the correct answer to her questions, and had been either beheaded or hanged. But there was not one who had not been warned beforehand, and he need not have proposed. Still, the old king was so upset and sorry about all the suffering that once a year he spent a whole day on his knees and ordered his whole army to do the same. They prayed that the princess would become good, but she didn't. The old ladies who drank scraps colored it black to show that they were in mourning, and that was the most they could do. "What a horrible princess!" said Joannes. "She should be switched, that is what she deserves. I would beat her until I drew blood." Just at that moment, they heard the people outside shouting, "Hurrah!" was riding by. She was so beautiful that anyone who looked at her forgot how wicked she was, and that's why everyone was now shouting, "Hurrah!" 12 lovely maidens in white silk dresses with golden tulips in their hands riding on jet black horses, were with her. The princess herself rode a milk white horse. Its bridle was set with rubies and diamonds. Her dress was one of the purest gold, and the whip she carried in her hand looked like a sunbeam. The golden crown on her head was like the stars of heaven, and her cape was made out of thousands of beautiful wings. And yet, she was far more beautiful than all her clothes. When Joanne saw her, and his face became as red as blood dripping from a wound, and he could not utter a word. The princess looked like the girl with the golden crown that he had dreamed about the night his father died. She was so beautiful, and he already loved her so much that he could not believe that she was an evil witch who ordered men to be beheaded or hanged because they could not guess the answer to the question she asked. Anyone could propose to her, even a poor man like me. I will go to the castle, for nothing can stop me from going, Joanne announced. Everyone begged him not to go, for they all agreed that he would fare no better than the others who had tried. Even his traveling companion advised him against it, but Joanne was not to be dissuaded. He brushed his clothes, polished his shoes, and combed his yellow hair. Then he went alone into town and straight up to the castle. "Come in," called the old king when Joanne came knocking. Joanne opened the door up to the castle, and the old king, wearing a dressing gown and embroidered slippers, welcomed him. The king had his golden crown on his head, his scepter in one hand, and the golden apple stay in the other. "Wait a moment," he said, while he tucked the apple under his arm so that he could shake hands with Joanne's. But as soon as he heard that it was another suitor who had come, he started to cry so bitterly that both the apple and the scepter fell to the floor, and he had to dry eyes with his dressing gown. Poor old king. "Don't do it," he begged. "You will be more fortunate than any of the others. Come and see." And he led Joanne into the princess's private garden. Ugh! It was a horrible sight. In every tree were hanging the bodies of 3 or 4 princes who had proposed marriage to the princess, but had not been able to answer the 3 questions she asked. When the wind blew, their skeletons rattled and made such a racket that they frightened all the birds so that none ever flew into the garden. The vines wound themselves around the human bones, and grinning skulls filled the flower pots instead of flowers. Wasn't that a fine garden for a princess? "Look around you," said the king. "You will end up like all the others. So please, please don't propose to my daughter. It really makes me very unhappy. I am very sensitive on that point." Joanne kissed the old king's hand and said that he was sure everything would be all right, for he was very much in love with the lovely princess. At that moment, the princess came riding into the castle yard, followed by all the ladies in waiting. The king and Joanne went out to greet her. How beautiful she was, and she gave Joanne her hand. Now he was even more in love than he had ever been before. Surely, she could not be a cruel and wicked witch. They all went up into the great hall, and there the page boys served cookies and jam. But the old king was so sad that he didn't eat anything. Besides, he thought the cookies were too hard. It was decided that Joanne was to come to the castle the next morning, and there, in front of the judges and the king's council, answer the questions the princess would ask. If he could answer it, then he would have to come back and answer 2 more questions on the 2 following days. But no one as yet had ever answered the princess's first question, so the day she asked it had been the last of their lives. Joanne was not worried or frightened about what was going to happen. He was happily dreaming about the beautiful princess. He was confident that God would help him, though he didn't know exactly how, nor did he give it much thought as he skipped through the streets on his way back to the inn, where his friend was waiting for him. Joanne could not stop talking about how beautiful the princess was and how kindly she had received him. He longed for the next day when he would see her again and try his luck at guessing the answer to the question. His friend shook his head. He was not happy. "I am very fond of you," he said. "We could have remained together a long time yet, and now I have to lose you. Poor dear Joanne, I feel like crying, but shan't do it. It would spoil our last evening together. So let us be happy, let us be gay. Tomorrow when you are gone, there will be time for my tears." The whole town had heard that princess had a new suitor, and they all went into mourning. The theater was closed, and the little old ladies who sold candy put black crepes around their chocolate pigs. The king and all the priests went to church and prayed on their knees. Everyone was miserable, for no one believed that the poor Joanne would fare better than all the other suitors had. Late in the evening, the wayfarer ordered a bowl of punch and said to Joanne that now that ought to drink to the health of the princess. When Johannes had drunk his second glass, he was so tired that he no longer could keep his eyes open and fell asleep. His friend lifted him gently from the chair and laid him on the bed. When the darkest hour of the night had almost come, Johannes' friend tied the swan's wing on his back and stuck into the pocket the largest bunch of switches that he had gotten from the old lady for cutting her leg. He opened the window and flew out over the town to the royal castle, where he landed on the balcony on the princess and hid in a corner next to her window. The clock in the tower struck the 1/4 It would soon be midnight. The whole town was still. Suddenly the princess' window opened and out she flew, her white cape trailing behind her. On her back were a pair of large black wings. The wayfarer made himself invisible so that no one could see him. Behind the princess, he flew, whipping her so hard that he drew blood. She was flying towards the big black mountain beyond the city. The wind took hold of her cape and spread it out like the sail of a ship, and the moon shone through it. "Oh, how it is hailing! How it is hailing!" moaned the princess every time the switches hit her back. Finally, when she reached the mountain, she knocked on it as if it was a door. The mountain rumbled like thunder and opened itself to the princess and could enter. Right behind her was Johannes' friend, though she could not see him for he was invisible. They were walking through in long high corridors. The walls were lighted curiously by the glow of red spiders who ran up and down like little flames. Now they were in a great hall built of silver and gold. Along the walls was a row of blue and red flowers as large as sunflowers, but one could not pick them, for their stems were snakes and their faces were the fire shooting out of the snake's mouth. The ceilings were studded with glowworms, and the sky-blue bats whose thin, fragile wings beat constantly. What a strange sight! In the middle of the hall stood a throne, which rested on the skeletons of 4 horses. Their bridles were made of red spiders. The seat of the throne itself was milk-white glass, and the pillows were little black mice who were biting each other's tail. Above, it was a canopy made of pink spider webs decorated with little green flies that shone like precious stones. On the throne sat an old troll with a crown on his ugly head and a scepter in his hand. He kissed the princess on the forehead and invited her to sit down beside him on the throne. Now the music began. Big black grasshoppers played on mouth organs. Owls beat themselves on their stomachs. They were the drums. It was a funny concert. Small black trolls with jack-o'-lanterns in their hats were dancing. No one could see the wayfarer who was standing behind the throne watching and listening to everything. The courtiers entered. They were very elegant and distinguished, but anyone who looked at them carefully could see that they really were cabbage heads attached to broomsticks, which the troll had made alive by witchcraft and then dressed in beautifully embroidered robes. But they were of no importance. Courts are only for show. After the dancing had gone on for a while, the princess told the troll about her new suitor and asked him what questions she could ask him the next morning. "Listen," said the troll. "Ask him to guess what you are thinking about, and then think about something very commonplace, because he will never guess that. Just think of your shoes. Then have his head cut off, but don't forget to bring me his eyes tomorrow night. I love to eat them." The princess curtsied most humbly and said that she wouldn't forget the eyes. Then the troll commanded the mountain to open itself again, and the princess started her flight back to the castle. Johannes' friend was flying right behind her, and he beat her so severely with his switches that she moaned loudly about the terrible hailstorm, and was glad when she finally reached the window of her bedchamber. The wayfarer flew back to the inn, where Johannes was still sleeping. He took off his wings and went to bed, for he had a right to be tired. Very early the next morning, when Johannes awoke, his friend told him that he had a strange dream. He had dreamed about the princess and her shoes. So when the princess asks you what she is thinking about, do remember to say, "Her shoes." He said, of course, that was what he had heard the troll tell the princess that she should be thinking about, but the wayfarer did not tell Johannes about the visit to the mountain. "Well, I can just as well say one thing as the other," said Johannes. "And maybe you have dreamed the true answer, for I am sure that God wants to help me. Still, I think we should say goodbye to each other, for if I guess wrong, I shall never see you again." They kissed, and Johannes went into the town and straight up to the castle. The big hall was filled with people. All the judges sat in easy chairs and had elder brown pillows on which to rest their heads, for they had grave matters to think about. The king paced the floor with the white handkerchief in his hands and constantly dried his eyes. The princess entered. She had even more beautiful than she had ever been. The day before, she greeted everyone graciously and kindly, and took Joanne's hand in hers and said, "Good morning, my dear friend." Now Joanne had to guess what she was thinking about. She looked over so kindly towards him, but when she heard the words "shoes," her face grew as white as chalk and her body shook. She couldn't hide that Joanne had given the right answer. Glory be, how happy the old king was! He turned a somersault, and the people clapped both for him and for Joanne, who had guessed the answer to the first question. Joanne's friend was pleased when he heard how well everything had gone, but Joanne folded his hands and thanked God, for he was certain that it was he who had helped him and would probably help him with the other questions. The following morning, he would have to answer the second one. The second evening passed just like the first, and as soon as Joanne slept, his traveling companion tied the swan's wings onto his back and followed the princess. But he now brought along 2 of the bundles of switches and beat her even harder. Again, no one saw him, and he heard everything that was said. This time, the princess was to think about her gloves. Early the next morning, he told Joanne that he had dreamed that the princess would think of her gloves. When Joanne guessed correctly, the whole court turned somersaults as they had seen the king do the day before, but the princess had to lie down in her pavilion and wouldn't speak to anyone. Now everything depended on what Joanne said the next morning. If he guessed right the 3rd time, she would have to marry him, and he would inherit the kingdom where her father died. But if he didn't, he would lose his life and would eat his pretty eyes. That evening, Joanne went to bed early, said his prayers, and slept peacefully, while the Wayfarer tied the swan's wings on his back, dug his sword into his belt, and taking all 3 bundles of switches with him, flew to the castle. It was pitch dark. There was such a storm that the tiles were blown off the roofs, and the trees in the princess's garden, in which the skeletons hung, swayed as reeds do in the wind. Every minute the lightning flashed and the thunder roared continuously, as if it were one great thunderclap and lasted the whole night through. The window opened, the princess flew out. Her face was white as death, but she laughed at the storm, which was not wild enough for her taste. Her white cape whirled around her like a great sail. Joanne's friend beat her so hard with the 3 bundles of birch branches that blood dripped down on the earth far below, and the princess could hardly fly. At last she reached the mountain. "It is hailing! What a storm!" she said to the troll. "I have never been out in weather like that before." "Yes, you can get too much of a good thing," said the troll. Now the princess told him that Joanne had guessed what she had been thinking a second time. "If he guesses right again tomorrow, then he will have won. I shall never visit the mountain again and never be able to do any more magic. Oh, it is so sad! He will not be able to guess your thoughts tomorrow, not unless he is a greater wizard than I am. I shall think of something that he has never seen. Now, let us be merry." The troll took the princess by the hand, and they danced among the little trolls and the jack-o'-lanterns on the walls. The glowing red spiders ran up and down like tiny tongues of fire. The owls beat the drums, the crickets sang, the black grasshoppers blew in their mouth organs. It was a grand ball. They danced until it was very late, and the princess had to return or she would be missed at the castle. The troll said he would follow her home. That would give them a little more time together. As they flew through the storm, Joanne's friend wore out his 3 bundles of switches on their backs. Never before had the troll experienced such a hailstorm outside the castle. He said goodbye to the princess and whispered to her, "Think of my head." The Wayfarer had heard that the troll said, just as the princess had disappeared into the bedchamber as the troll turned to fly home. He grabbed him by the long black beard and with one stroke of his sword cut off the troll's head. He threw the body into the lake for the fishes to eat, but the ugly head he wrapped in his silk handkerchief and took it with him to the inn. Then he went to bed and to sleep. The next morning he gave the handkerchief to Joanne, but told him that he must not untie it before the princess had asked him to guess what she was thinking about. The big ball in the castle was so crowded with people that they were stood as close together as radishes do when they have been bound in bunches by a farmer. The judges in the king's council were sitting in their easy chairs, resting their heads on the eider-down pillows. The king had put on brand new robes and had his crown and his scepter polished, which made them look very nice. But the princess was very pale and dressed in black. She looked as if she was attending a funeral. "What am I thinking about?" she asked. Joanne untied the handkerchief. He was shocked and frightened when he saw the horrible head of the troll. All the people shuddered, for it was a terrifying sight, but the princess sat as still as a stone statue and did not utter a word. At last she rose, without looking at anyone or anything, without turning to the right or the left. She sighed deeply, gave Johannes her hand and said, "Now you are my master. Tonight we shall be married." "That's what I like to hear," shouted the king. "That's the way it ought to be." Everyone shouted hurrah. The royal guards marched down the streets with the band in front of them. The church bells rang. The old ladies who sold the candy took the black crepe off their chocolate pigs. 3 oxen stuffed with ducks and chickens were roasted on the town square for everyone to eat. The fountain splashed the finest wine, and if you bought 2 pennies worth of pretzels, then the baker gave you 6 muffins with raisins as part of the bargain. When everything came, the whole town was illuminated. The soldiers fired their cannons, and little boys shot off firecrackers. In the castle, all the most elegant people in the country were gathered. They ate and drank and toasted with each other. All the young people danced. One could hear the younger singing away. So many a fair maiden calls for a dance so gay. The air with music is laden. Beautiful maiden, turn around. Stamp your feet and whirl until your shoes are worn out. But the princess was still a witch and didn't love Johannes at all. The Wayfarer had not forgotten this, so she gave Johannes 3 feathers from the swan's wings and a little bottle filled with liquid, and said to him, "Tonight, next to the marriage bed, place a large tub of water and throw these feathers and empty liquid into it. When the princess starts to get into bed, push her into the tub and duck her 3 times under the water. Then she will no longer be a witch and will love you dearly." Johannes took his friend's advice. When he shoved the princess underneath the water the first time, she screamed and changed into a black swan with fiery eyes, who wiggled and stranded its grasp. The second time she was plunged into water, she became a white swan with a black ring around her neck. Johannes prayed to God as he pushed her under the 3rd time, and instantly she changed into the most beautiful princess. She was ever lovelier than before, and she thanked him with tears in her eyes for having broken the evil spell. The next day, the king came visiting, so did the court and half of the people of the town. They all wanted to pay their respects to the bridal couple. Last of all came Johannes' traveling companion. He had a knapsack on his back and a walking stick in his hand. Johannes kissed him and begged him not to leave. "All my good fortune is your doing," he cried. But his friend shook his head. Then he spoke softly and gently. "No, my time on earth is over. I have paid my debts. Do you remember the dead man whom the evil man wanted to harm? You gave everything you owed so that he could rest in his coffin. I am the dead man." With those words, he disappeared. The wedding celebration lasted a month. Johannes and the princess loved each other ever so much. The old king lived for many years and enjoyed having his grandchildren sit on his knees and play with his scepter, while Johannes ruled the whole kingdom. The end.